so much for joining us tonight. I'm just super grateful that we are here tonight with two fabulous women. My name is Kitty Douglas, and I am president of BigTent USA. At BigTent USA, we are steadfast in our commitment to defending our democratic values, the Constitution, and the rule of law. Our goal is to empower you with facts and calls to actions so you can become a stronger, more effective advocate for our country. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome Joyce Vance and Vanita Gupta to Big Tent. Joyce White Vance is a distinguished professor of law at the University of Alabama, a legal analyst for NBC and MSNBC, and the author of the Civil Discourse newsletter. She co-hosts the podcast Sisters in Law and Insider with Preet Bharara. Joyce is a former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Alabama under President Obama and the author of the new book and why we are here tonight, Giving Up is Unforgivable. Vanita Gupta is a distinguished scholar in residence and director of the Center of Law and Public Trust at NYU Law. She served as the 19th Associate Attorney General of the United States from 2021 to 2024, leading key Justice Department divisions and initiatives on police reform, reproductive rights, and environmental justice. Joyce and Vanita, thank you so much for coming to Big Tent. Vanita, I will turn the call over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And wow, what a group of people from all over the country. It's so inspiring to see how many people have jumped on. I am really excited because I get to be here in conversation with my dear, dear friend, Joyce Vance, who has written just an incredible book that is like a balm for people's soul right now. Giving Up is Unforgivable. It really couldn't have landed at a better time, Joyce. And I want to thank you for taking the time to write it, because it is very hard to write a book. But we really truly needed it at this moment. So I actually want to start, Joyce. And Joyce and I worked together in the Justice Department during the Obama administration, and she was an incredible U.S. attorney who dedicated so much time to civil rights lawyering, and she has that is where our friendship started, and it has since really blossomed. And I was reading the book today and over the weekend, and I have to say, Joyce, I want to start from the beginning of this book, and I have a question to ask, which is how was it writing a book titled Giving Up is Unforgivable as the Trump administration was beginning to destroy and dismantle, the institution you and I both care about, the Justice Department, but also kind of our democracy, agencies across the federal government, hurting and harming communities around the country. Like, what was it like to try to write this book, which is really a prescription for hope and the work that each of us need to do to protect our democracy during this time?
So this is a little bit like childbirth, right? You try to completely forget about it because it was just tough to live through. Let me start by thanking everybody at Big Tent for being here. And Kitty, thank you so much for hosting us tonight. Y'all, everything Vanita says is true. We have a friendship that was forged in doing civil rights work during what Attorney General Holder often referred to as the golden age at the Justice Department. It was an honor. It was a blessing. I look back on it with so much fondness, and I miss it so much because it's no longer the moment that we are living in. And that became pretty starkly obvious to me as I sat down to start writing this book about the time that Donald Trump was inaugurated. And so this is how it would go. I would write a few pages, and then something would happen, and I would just rip them up and throw them away. And that was really my first couple of weeks of writing, because I'm sure y'all remember everything was happening, everything everywhere all at once. Project 2025, which we had all anticipated, was being implemented pretty immaculately at lightning speed by a president who was slow off the blocks during his first administration and maybe had lulled some of us into the belief it wouldn't be as bad as it was. DOJ was happening. As Vanita says, government was being disassembled. Immigrants were being treated horribly. We knew it was coming. It started quickly. And so it was really a tough project to write the book while I was focused on all of the bad things. And how weak were we that this one man could come in and undo so much good stuff that had happened during Vanita's time in office with the Biden administration and during our time together during the Obama administration. That really threw me for a loop until I realized that my focus was wrong. Instead of focusing on where we were weak, where we had problems, I needed to focus on where we were strong and what we could do, because Donald Trump really wanted us to not believe in ourselves. And so by finding reasons to believe in us again and looking at what we could do, I finally sort of got my groove back and was able to write the book despite everything that was going on.
Yeah, it's and I'm so glad actually that you started the book with that very honest reflection, because as I was reading the book, I was just like, understanding the period of time that you were writing this and thinking, gosh, what an like kind of juxtaposition and struggle. And in some ways, it's more honest to write what you're writing while you're witnessing what we're witnessing and going through than it is to do it after the fact, because we're living the real harm of a regime that is truly, discounting and undermining democratic norms and communities. And so in some ways it's a very honest reflection, and should give us all hope. One thing that I've also been thinking about is you've been traveling around the country to talk about the book, and I'm curious about what you're finding the mood is in the communities that you've been in. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how the book is being received and what, where you've been and what has resonated with you in the last 2 weeks.
So obviously, people who come to hear somebody like me talk about a book that they've written are self selected in, right? I mean, we all get that, right? In America, we increasingly live in our bubbles. I will say it's been a lot of fun having people who've sort of dragged their husband or brought a daughter along. Those have been some of my favorite conversations that I've had. But I've been, New York, Ohio, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Atlanta. So crisscrossing the country. And here's my takeaway. It is an incredibly uplifting moment to talk to people because, by and large, especially when I'm signing books afterwards, people walk up to me and they quietly tell me what they're doing. They volunteered with the League of Women Voters. They're involved in a community talk group that's examining candidates for the next election. Whether it's federal politics, state or local politics, something that I'm learning is Americans are deeply involved and people understand that this is a moment where they have to pay attention and get involved. And my worst fear, quite frankly, was people would feel so overwhelmed by what Trump is doing that they would tune out and stop paying attention, which of course makes his job easier, right? I mean, every dictator, every autocrat knows that it's easier if they can just get you to voluntarily relinquish your rights and relinquish your civic engagement, as opposed to if they have to force you to do it. What I'm learning as I talk to people across the country is we're doubling down, right? You want to take away my right to vote? People understand that no one would be doing that unless your right to vote was really important. And Americans are determined to fight.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was so hard in the early months, and it's hard to believe it hasn't even been a year yet, but was the feeling that people were a little cowed or quiet. And you saw this with the law firms that started to capitulate to what were blatantly unconstitutional orders. You've seen it with leaders of universities and others, capitulating or giving into what is essentially government bullying. And also people in the beginning who weren't speaking up or were hoping to just get by laying low. And, for some of us that attended the No Kings rallies just a few weeks ago, the kind of opposite of that in the streets and in our communities, it sounds like that's what you're getting reflected back from where you're going. And just the like people power and the joy of being together and standing up for our rights. Like I've really felt a palpable shift in some of the way people are showing up right now. And so I am curious, like, you talk in your book a lot about reflecting on history as well. And I often, Joyce, you know this, I draw a lot of hope from understanding the struggles that people have been through historically and understanding the role that people played, their courage in speaking out and speaking up and fighting back in some of the most difficult periods of our history. Tell us just a little bit about why you also take that tack on reflecting on history, and maybe a couple of examples from your own book that you want to share that I think help also put this moment in a bit of context.
You know, history is so comforting, right? I've always loved history without really thinking about why. Increasingly, I understand it's because it helps us take comfort that our current struggles can be resolved because we've worked through problems in the past. And so, y'all, so I obviously, with this horrible accent, live in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the cradles of the civil rights
It's not
movement.
horrible, Joyce. It's beautiful.
You know, I try to not lapse into Southern, but all Southerners do that, and it's tough not to do. But seriously, we have this amazing culture here. It's so easy to write, say, Alabama, and to write it off. And yet, because I was lucky enough to marry into a family where people cared about and were involved in civil rights, I've had these really interesting experiences. And my father-in-law, who was involved in the Democratic Party when Alabama was not all that long ago, an all Democratic state, Democrats at every level of state government, he at one point had the temerity to hire a Black organist for his very, important church in Birmingham, and he was condemned by other people, and I think was taken out of a leadership role for just, having the audacity to hire someone who turned out to be a really talented Black organist and went on to play at Grace Episcopal Church in Manhattan. I think I've got that right. But my point is this. I had the opportunity throughout my career to talk with people who were very engaged in the civil rights movement. Little stories like that. Civil rights leaders, but also the foot soldiers. And something that you learn when you spend time around the foot soldiers is that they were just completely incapable of giving up. They understood that the deck was stacked against them in the civil rights movement, right? This is an era when people are being asked to guess how many bubbles there are in a bar of soap, and then being told that they can't register to vote because they're not smart enough to answer the question. And when you talk to folks who worked in the civil rights movement, what they tell you is the path forward is in community. Always be in community when you have problems. Never worry about something horrible alone. And that's really the message for our moment, right? It's in community, whether it's an online community or an in-person one, that we begin to find the path forward. And so, Vanita, you asked for a story, and I'll share one that I think is near and dear to both of our hearts. The University of Alabama is integrated. There's this famous stand in the schoolhouse door where the governor, George Wallace, literally, makes this pretense of using his body to bar entry to the first two African-American students who matriculate. One of them is a woman named Vivian Malone Jones, and she does not have an easy time at the University of Alabama. She gives an interview later on where she describes one day where there are bombs that are going off in proximity to her apartment, and she has to decide whether to go to class or not. And she does not give up. She decides she's going to go to class. She needs to show people. And so in a moment where there's an effort to exclude Black students from participating at the university, instead of abandoning a system that would like to abandon and erase them, people like Vivian Malone Jones demand their inclusion. And she completes her education at the university. She goes on to have a stellar career, part of it at the United States Justice Department. 50 years later, the University of Alabama is commemorating that moment, the stand in the schoolhouse door where the university is integrated. And the sitting attorney general is Vivian Malone Jones' brother-in-law, Eric Holder. Maybe that's not a straight line, but there certainly is some sort of a lineage there that tells us that with persistence and insistence, progress is possible, even when it seems impossible in the moment.
It's such a powerful story, and it really is why we have to continue to also be in community, but also remind ourselves of these stories, because there is so much courage in our history. And when you think about it, I mean, you think about the country emerging from slavery and Jim Crow and civil rights warriors who had not just kind of policy and elected politicians against them, but actually law against them, and the work that it took, the campaigns that they led, being on the front lines, that is something to remember even on our darkest day. That I think is, I thought, really powerful in your book, that you were telling these stories to help situate the current moment. Where, not that it's the same, every period is different and there are different struggles, but to situate what can come through, as you said, through persistence and insistence, which I think is just so incredibly important. I was wondering, Joyce, just there's a lot out there. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit about some of the policy work. You talk a lot in your book about how democracy isn't a promise, it is a project. And I think that's really powerful. And Congressman John Lewis said, democracy is not a state, it's an act, right? Like, this is our time to show what democracy means to us. Can you just talk a little bit about what you see as the types of small acts that we can engage in that are the work of democracy? Like, what do you identify, and are you seeing it kind of happening? You talked a little bit about what you're seeing from some of your book tour, but like, how do you define the work of democracy? What does it look like?
You know, I've been lucky enough to have some really great examples in my life who actually walked the walk and showed you what democracy looked like when they were in powerful positions and could just as easily have done nothing or stayed in offices in Washington. But instead, I'm going to tell a story that's not in my book. This is a story from my time in office as a U.S. attorney. And so Alabama is, you know, it's a big state, and my district covers everything from Birmingham up to Huntsville, up to the border. Huntsville is heavily military, and there's also a well-established scientific community because Wernher von Braun went to Huntsville and worked there during World War II. And as a sitting U.S. attorney, we had a civil rights incident where a man who worked in that scientific community, his dad had come over to visit him from India to help him after the birth of a child. And the granddad is walking around, just walking in the morning, when someone in the neighborhood takes offense, calls the police to say that there's a suspicious black man looking into people's garages. The police show up, and a hepped up cop who probably has 250 pounds on the grandfather, who's a very small elderly man, body sweeps him, partially paralyzes him. It's one of the worst police abuses that we've seen. And we need to talk to our community and tell them that we will be there for them, because this is a minority community that doesn't have the comfort level that law enforcement has their back. And so we decide we need to speak with them. And I called the brand new Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division, Vanita Gupta. And I say, I know you're busy. I know you're brand new. Could you please come down? And she gets on a plane and she comes down to Birmingham, and we talk to people in Birmingham, and we go and we visit the community where they live, and we speak with them. We meet with them in their homes. We end up prosecuting the case, and it does not have a happy ending because the jury in North Alabama refused to convict, and the judge didn't want us to retry the case, and ultimately, as judges do, had her way in that regard. But what mattered was that someone who was so powerful, who could have stayed in Washington and done her job there, decided to come to people. And you know, Vanita, I have never forgotten that you did that, and how touching it was to see you treat people like they were human beings, which it seems to me is what's animating everything we're living through right now. A moment where some people are willing to pick and choose who gets to be a human being. And then there are those of us who see humanity everywhere and want to make sure that that's the country that we live in, a country where everyone is treated like a human being.
Joyce, you're making me get all teary, because honestly, you forget some things, and now it's so vivid. I remember that case so well. it was such a painful, painful case. And yet the thing that mattered, and I feel like this is important for everyone, is Joyce she's giving me credit, but Joyce was the face and the hope locally in the community for a community that was afraid of law enforcement and didn't feel comfortable speaking out. There were a lot of language barriers. And Joyce in her office took this case so incredibly seriously and showed up. This is what it meant to be part of a Justice Department that was all over the country and that sought to vindicate people's civil rights, even sometimes when it meant we might lose. And it was so important for communities to see the United States government standing up for the rights of the most vulnerable and marginalized. And I hate to take it away from this example, but I think there's a lot of people on this Zoom who are really upset and concerned, rightfully so, about what's happening at the Justice Department right now. And I know you and I are deeply, Joyce. Can you reflect a little bit about what you think is happening at the Justice Department right now? What most concerns you in terms of, the rule of law and protecting vulnerable communities that are in harm's way right now, which has been, for decades, a traditional role for the Justice Department. Tell us a little bit more about some of your reflections on that.
During the campaign, I was repeatedly accused of being a drama queen when I said that Donald Trump would turn the Justice Department into something unrecognizable, that he was intent upon weaponizing it and using it for revenge. You're never a prophet in your own house, right? Because we all know what's happening in front of our eyes. This is a Justice Department that has a spineless sitting attorney general. Donald Trump feels free to drop unqualified people in to do his bidding. It is a Justice Department that has become a political tool in the White House's toolkit. And that is not the Justice Department's job. It seems just so obvious to say that out loud, but I don't think that we can say that enough right now. As we watch a DOJ where the Civil Rights Division, is as you knew it and ran it, Vanita, it no longer exists. The Public Integrity Unit, which prosecuted public corruption cases and also was an experienced unit in Washington, D.C. that worked with the 94 U.S. attorneys' offices nationwide to help them prosecute public corruption cases, that's gone in the blink of an eye. We now know, because we've seen it happen in the Southern District of New York, that this Justice Department will dismiss righteous prosecutions against corrupt politicians like New York City's mayor so that this administration can score political points, and that it will indict this president's enemies, or people who he thinks are his enemies, like the former director of the FBI, Jim Comey, like New York's Attorney General Letitia James. We've just recently seen news, and this is perhaps the most outrageous so far, that there's a grand jury that's been impaneled in the Southern District of Florida, in the division where a judge named Aileen Cannon sits. She is the judge who slow-walked the Mar-a-Lago prosecution to death. And, it's utterly insane. You might ask, well, what crime are they investigating down in the Southern District of Florida? Well, we don't know, because they're sending out subpoenas that don't specify a crime. But it looks like, and there's reporting from reporters who seem to have good sourcing, that there's an allegation that there was some sort of a cabal, a conspiracy that was going after Donald Trump. And it references back to the Russia investigation in the 2016 election. And the weird thing about that, right, is that happened, if you believe that anything happened, which I don't, in Washington, D.C. That's where the people who allegedly were involved in this conspiracy, which they say may even involve Barack Obama, they were sitting in Washington, D.C., doing their jobs and doing them well. And so you've got to wonder. You don't really have to wonder, because we all know what's going on with a Justice Department that's willing to do that, instead of doing the work that we all treasured so much at DOJ, protecting marginalized communities, making sure that their rights were protected, that we protected the right to vote, that we were focused on horrible crimes like human trafficking or cartel-based drug dealing. And just the one last thing I'll say, because I'm now using you guys for therapy to get this off my chest, is that when we did immigration cases, we focused, and this was an explicit policy during our administration, we focused on people with violent criminal history who were in the United States, people who were gang affiliated who were in the United States without legal immigration status. And those were the people that we used our resources to arrest and prosecute. That's not what's happening right now. I mean, right now, they are out arresting moms who are dropping off their kids at school, who are going to the grocery store to buy food. This is just pick the low-hanging fruit, treat people in an inhumane fashion, disappear them off of streets, don't give them any due process, and it's not making our communities safer. That's the big mythology here. Donald Trump said that he would protect the country from criminals using DOJ resources. And that's not what's happening. So I don't know if I'm assessing DOJ or just having a good therapy session, but the reality is there will be a lot of necessary work to restore the Justice Department when this is over.
You couldn't have said it better. And it is horrifying what is happening. It's scary too that, as I said, we're 1 year in. But I want to, your book actually tackles other issues too, like the breakdown of voting infrastructure and what's happening to the judiciary. And I'm going to get to the hope piece because that's a major feature of Joyce's book. And it's why every single one of you needs to go out and buy it and keep it by your bedside, because every night I think we should all be reading pages from it to like infuse ourselves with the hope that we need and the work that we need to do. But we still need Joyce's analysis. So Joyce, people are worried about the election. So we came off of a Tuesday election that was very exciting. I'm going to skip over the shutdown. I know folks have a lot of feelings about that, but let's talk about voting in the elections, because I think this is important. There's a lot of concern about, are we going to have elections? Are we going to, what could happen, with the results, et cetera? I firmly believe we will have elections. I think a lot of good people are working very hard to ensure that there's no shenanigans and mischief done with the results. But tell us a little bit about what you're worried about in the state of voting rights. And of course, Alabama being a hotbed and a recent Supreme Court case that was argued around redistricting that could reshape districts in Alabama.
A lot of the time, the first question people will ask is, will there be elections in 2026 and 2028? I feel certain that the answer to that is yes, because there's nothing that a wannabe dictator likes better than to cloak himself in this aura of legitimacy that elections bring. So yes, there will be elections. The question is, will they be free and fair? That's where I think we come in, right? All of us have a role to play in this. It will not be easy. We will have to work hard to protect these upcoming elections. The great thing is we know that now, because we've seen Donald Trump push, for instance, the SAVE Act, where he's claiming that people who aren't citizens are voting in dramatic numbers and that will steal the election from Republicans in 2026. And y'all, I'm just here to tell you that is not true. Voter fraud is a myth in large part. Yes, there might be an isolated instance here and there. And when it happens, it gets caught by election officials and it gets prosecuted. But my Bush predecessor in North Alabama for 8 years looked hard and fast to find voting fraud evidence. She would have been delighted to prosecute a case. That was a big push in that administration. She never found a single case. During my 8 years in office, we looked just as hard. We never found a case. And during his 4 years in office, my Trump successor, same deal. I mean, voting fraud is really more or less just a myth. The real problem is voter suppression, the effort to keep people who are entitled to vote from voting, to make it hard for them to vote. And I had this fascinating conversation with Angus King, who is a senator in Maine now, but who at the time this happened was the governor of Maine. He had a longstanding bet with Jesse Ventura, who y'all remember from WWE, who was the governor in Minnesota. And they had a standing bet to see which state could have higher voter turnout. And he said that at some point, the people around him said, Governor, if you're trying to get a lot of people to vote, maybe not all of those people are going to vote for you. But Angus King understood something that many of our politicians have lost, which is that your right to vote is fundamental. It is a right you possess as an American citizen. Who you vote for, that's a political choice, and it's up to politicians to fight for your vote and to compete in the marketplace of ideas so that you will choose them. Your right to vote, every elected official has an obligation to do everything that they can to make sure that you can exercise it. And we do not live in a world where that's happening. So I think one of the first things we have to start thinking about is demanding that our elected officials do more to protect our rights, and this one in particular. You know, that's a little bit Pollyannish because in 2026, we're simply going to have to do whatever it takes to be able to vote. Wait in long lines? Yes. Educate yourself about changed polling places? Yes. We will be in a fight for identification, I fear, in many states where you will have to prove citizenship to be able to register to vote. And that, friends, is a poll tax. I'm from Alabama. I know a poll tax when I see one, making people get costly passports. Folks who might not have the means to get them is a poll tax. And we need to pull together as communities and start thinking now about how we're going to make sure that all of our fellow citizens will have what it takes to vote. So it will be a struggle. I am confident that we can do it. And it's so much easier to make this argument now because we actually did do it a week ago, this past Tuesday, where Democrats, you know, it's not just that Democrats won, it's that pro-democracy candidates and pro-democracy policies were the overwhelming choice of voters, not just at the federal, or really not a federal election at all, but not just at the state level, but at the local level as well. For instance, in Georgia, where they flipped 3 seats on the PSC, Republican to Democratic, and it's on these issues. It's because Americans now understand that that's what drives democracy.
Yeah, and it's, you know, another thing that we're going to need people power for is signing up as poll workers and poll watchers. And
poll watchers to watch the poll watchers,
watch
where
the poll
DOJ
watchers,
sends poll watchers
all
to
of it.
California. Yeah.
No, that's right. And so, and in part because the Justice Department has lost its ability to help protect elections, and this Justice Department may be working at cross purposes. So it's going to take all of us. It's a perfect example of what you write about in your book about the importance of all of us seeing ourselves in the work of democracy. And there's going to be ways to plug in when city councils and town councils are meeting to try to change local election rules or move polling places, you know, to particular neighborhoods that may be less accessible for certain communities. Like, it is going to require all of us showing up to those meetings and those council meetings and demanding that our local officials, you know, are making sure that they aren't moving things or doing things and making changes that could really impact voter participation. So there's a lot of ways for us to plug in, and I know that your book talks about others too. The Supreme Court, just speaking about voting, I'm going to tie it now to the court because a lot of people have been thinking a lot about the Supreme Court. Just took up a case yesterday, Joyce, from Mississippi, regarding mail-in ballot voting, which, you know, is the law in many states. And there's a lot of concern that if the Supreme Court, you know, that the Supreme Court could end up changing the availability of mail-in ballot voting to vote. Tell me, you know, what do you make of what's happening at the Supreme Court, and how can we as a community, I mean, understanding the role of the courts have also been the bulwark against some of the most egregious excesses of this administration. We've had a lot of district courts and courts of appeals standing up for the rule of law. Do you think that, well, let me first ask you about the Supreme Court, and then I'm going to come to the question that a lot of people ask me and probably ask you is, do you think we're at a constitutional crisis? But tell us first about the Supreme Court.
Well, every time the Supreme Court takes a voting rights case, I die a little bit inside, right? Because you know that they're not taking them to advance the cause. I mean, again, you know, early in the Obama administration, the court decides Shelby County versus Holder, and it guts Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And this is a little bit like law school, so I'll just try to do it quick and superficially. But the Voting Rights Act, it has a lot of moving parts, but two of the most important sections, Section 5 was a section that permitted people like Vanita and me and others in private practice to challenge measures that were anti-voting before they went into effect. In other words, if you were the state of Alabama and you wanted to pass a horrible anti-voting identification law, you had to submit that law for pre-clearance either to the Justice Department or a court in DC and get approval before it could go into effect. And that was just a fabulous preventative measure. But the Chief Justice who authored the opinion in that case, which gutted Section 5, it took away the criteria that were used to decide who and what had to be submitted for preclearance, effectively ending use of the section. And the Chief Justice wrote that times had changed and these sort of old racial sort of standards that we were used to no longer applied. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg in dissent had the better of him. She made this point. She said, gutting Section 5, taking away Section 5, is a little bit like shutting your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because you're not getting wet yet. And that was exactly what happened after Shelby County. People began to have trouble exercising their right to vote. But there was still Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is powerful, frequently used to combat gerrymandering, but it can be used for other sorts of inroads on voting rights. Section 2 means essentially that you have to wait until the bad thing happens, and then you can challenge it in court. So you can see why I liked Section 5 better when it was available. But Section 2, still good. And now we have not just the Mississippi case, but also a Section 2 case out of Louisiana. If you're seeing a lot of these cases come out of the Deep South, you're getting the point. The Louisiana
somebody in the
case,
chat, Joyce, asked about the Kelly case, so it'd be great if you could just describe it. I'm happy to chime in some more on that too, but I think
yeah,
interested in
so
understanding what's at stake.
this is Calais, the Louisiana gerrymandering case, where Louisiana, and this goes back to the Alabama case that was decided a couple of terms ago, that talked about gerrymandering and said that racial minorities were entitled to representation and couldn't be shut out of having the possibility, not that we guarantee people that they will elect candidates of their choice. People should have the opportunity. And so it created more minority opportunity districts. Alabama now has 2 African-American members in the House of Representatives, far more representative. Louisiana was on track to do that same thing until a group of white voters filed a challenge, arguing that their rights were being violated because the state was engaging in racial considerations in drawing these voting districts. And of course, I was going to swear, and I'm trying not to swear these days, but talking about voting rights puts me over the edge. That's a bunch of BS. We all understand the history in this country and the way Black voters were forced out of both the electorate and the ability to be elected, particularly with Jim Crow and with the early moments of the Civil Rights era. It's a work in progress. This is one of the most aspirational points in American democracy, where we've never reckoned with race. We've never made sure that Black voters and minority voters had the same opportunities as white voters. And now white voters in Louisiana are going to the Supreme Court saying, look at this horrible discrimination that we're experiencing. Please fix it.
Yeah, and how many seats are at stake in this case? Because I was kind of shocked when I heard, I don't know if I had heard that between 12 and 20, depending on how narrow or broad the court goes, Black majority districts are at stake right now. And so awaiting the outcome of this case. Does that mirror what you've been hearing about the stakes?
It does. And I think this is the key point. It's not just Louisiana that will be affected by the outcome. Alabama will lose districts. Fair Fight, which is, many of you may be familiar with, a Georgia organization started by Stacey Abrams and Lauren Groh-Wargo. They've sort of crunched data. I think they get those numbers. They say something in the range of 14 to 20, possibly more. And the reality is that those numbers will change the composition of the House of Representatives for a generation. This is a very, very significant sort of issue that we're facing in the hands of a Supreme Court that, of course, many of us, our confidence in it has been lessened as it has repeatedly seemed to put its thumb on the scales for Donald Trump. The criminal immunity case, I think, was for many people a gut shot. We had been raised to believe that no man was above the law. The Supreme Court seemed to say that the president was. And that really has put us on the dangerous path to where the country is right now. We will have to see. I think this is a moment where we take great comfort in the way that district court judges and courts of appeals judges have been steadfast and they have been unshakable. Even, these district judges where the president of the United States is putting a target on their back, calling them out, saying that they are engaging in a judicial coup. And these judges nonetheless stand strong. Look at the facts, look at the law. They treat the administration fairly. They treat the people asking for relief from what this administration is doing. They treat those people fairly. They write opinions. They do their jobs. If that's not a commitment to justice, I just don't know what is. And that's something that we can all feel good about. Increasingly, by the way, they are taking it to the Supreme Court, these lower court judges who are writing to the court. There's an opinion, 100+ pages out of Portland, Oregon, I think over the weekend, I'm losing track of the days, by Karen Immergut, a judge in Portland who is herself a Donald Trump appointee to the bench, who wrote and said when the president deployed troops, National Guard troops in Oregon, he exceeded his constitutional authority. And she then proceeds to write an airtight, constitutionally based opinion that will ultimately make its way to the Supreme Court. And she is going to make it very difficult for them to do anything other than affirm her because she was so dedicated when she wrote this opinion.
It's a very powerful opinion, and folks should definitely read it if you have time. And one of the things that has been really astonishing about what's happening is the threats to these judges that are issuing decisions upholding the Constitution and the rule of law. I have several friends, as I'm sure you do too, Joyce, that are doing immense public service to serve as district court judges who are facing death threats regularly. And it's not just, obviously, it's judges, it's election administrators that we are seeing face death threats, public servants who are being threatened and bullied. I mean, it's truly astonishing. And, we all have to condemn violence and political violence. I am very concerned about the degree of polarization that we are seeing in our communities in our country. And it's, on the one hand, it's very hard to talk about these issues and not feel an anger and upsettedness, but also a need to figure out some path against the polarization, which is, I think gone to extremes with also an asymmetrical media ecosystem that's just self-reinforcing everyone's views. What do you wrote this book for a reason. You've been talking a lot about a lot of these issues on TV. Why did you decide that you wanted to write a book rather in this moment?
Yeah, so there are a lot of moving parts in that question.
I know.
And I think, you're dead on the money, right? Like, this is the problem. We're a polarized society. People don't talk to each other. I suspect that for a lot of families, Thanksgiving dinner is going to be lit this year, right? Folks will sit down with people that they don't agree with, and they will try to have civil conversations. I'm sure y'all have struggles in your own lives. I live in Alabama. A lot of my close friends are Republicans. Many of them reject Donald Trump and what he stands for. A lot of them are folks who frankly voted for Donald Trump 1, 2, 3 times for reasons that I simply cannot get my mind around. It is a really tough moment. Do you give up on those people? Do you write them off? Do you try to stay in touch? Something that I know to be true is this. For the people around you, for your friends and your family, the most influential person that they talk to and hear from is you. It's not some guy in boxes on MSNBC, right? It's not somebody who's on Fox News. It's you, the person that they trust. And what we've really lost in this country is our grasp on facts. We live in this post-truth world where Kellyanne Conway coins the phrase alternative facts and just says, don't like the facts? Do the facts not support, the arguments that you want to make? Chuck the facts and just pick your own and make them up and use them and call them alternative facts. President's crowd size was largest any inauguration had ever seen. Just making stuff up out of whole cloth and convincing people to accept it. And here's what you can do. You can actually be the person who brings the facts. And when somebody spouts nonsense, if you're prepared to talk about facts, and when somebody says, oh, that's not true, whatever it is, Donald Trump didn't send National Guard troops from Texas into Oregon, you can actually show them. We all have these wonderful phones and we can actually display the truth. I don't want to pretend that that's easy because we live in a world now where people dispute the facts. It's not the ABC, NBC, CBS world where we all had common facts and we argued about what they meant. But something that you can do is on the issues where you know and where you have the facts. Don't ever be afraid to inject that into a conversation. That's not being rude. That's helping people do their job as American citizens in an era when it's become difficult because their leaders are lying to them. And that's the reality that we face. It's Donald Trump who's driving the disinformation. He did not create it. He's not solely responsible for it, but he sees it as valuable for his own purposes. And he uses it and he advances those falsehoods and those half-truths. And we all have to be the bulwark against that.
Yeah, and you've been writing on the Substack Civil Discourse for since 2022, I think since
3
June of
years, I think.
2022,
Yeah.
which I think is also an antidote to this notion of polarization. Like you are seeking to engage. You want to, in what you write, you are seeking to engage, not cut off and alienate. And so I think it's incredibly powerful. And you've been out there, Joyce.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second and
Yeah.
say something about that? Because I think this is something that tickles me that I think is important. So I write civil discourse for people who want to understand how the Justice Department is supposed to work. Because if, like Vanita and me, you've had the privilege of working there, you have an obligation, even when you leave, to help people understand the rule of law. And what I like so much is, my readers, my subscribers read the newsletter, and then sometimes they'll send it on to their crazy Uncle Jack, right? Uncle Jack, read this. Sometimes they'll CC me and I'll see what happens when they forward it. But a lot of the time, I'll get email back from Uncle Jack, who will say, I disagree with you when you say whatever it is that he takes objection to. And I try to really make time to engage in those conversations because I love the fact that people are taking what I say in the newsletter and sharing it forward, which seems to me very grassroots American. And look, there are people all over Substack who are, Heather Cox Richardson, who I bet 99% of you guys read and love because that historian perspective is so important.
Yeah.
Others who write in specialty areas about the law or write about legal issues and the rule of law in ways that we can share with the people around us.
I love that. It sounds like Joyce Vance is going to be looming over everyone's Thanksgiving table, either in the form of civil discourse or in the form of her book. It's a good conversation starter, and is actually fundamentally about hope. And I want to end, because I know we're getting close on time, about why you wrote this book, because you still haven't. I know we lost that. I was asking multi-layered questions. Why did you write this book, and what do you want people to take away from the book? What are we going to hold in our hearts when we read this book?
I'm sure everybody remembers the moment after Kamala Harris lost the election and people were devastated. People wondered how we were going to get through this next 4 years with Donald Trump. And what disturbed me the most, the loss was very painful. What disturbed me the most was people saying, I gave it everything that I had. We lost. There's nothing else I can do. I'm just going to walk away from it now. I can't do anything. And it seemed to me that that was a horrible moment for this country. There was a real prospect that Americans would just give up. And the idea that Donald Trump would come in uninhibited by any guardrails, uninhibited by voters. And y'all, I remember the first 4 years of Donald Trump, where it was you and me and this notion that sunlight is the best disinfectant that really kept some of the worst abuses of that administration from happening. So I was so disturbed by that was literally the impetus for the book. And I wanted to write sort of a love letter to my fellow Americans and just say, don't give up. Look at these examples from history. Look at how powerful our laws and the founding fathers and the documents that they left us are. We can do this, but what we can't do is voluntarily give up our rights to a bully, to a tyrant. What we have to do is work together, stay the course, hold on to democracy.
Joyce, you are a treasure. Thank you for writing the book. All of us, everybody needs to buy her book and read it and give it out as gifts over the holidays. It is so important for us to read and re-energize ourselves and to be in community with one another. So thank you, Joyce. Thanks to everyone for joining. But seriously, Joyce, it's an incredible book. We're so grateful you wrote it.
Thanks, Vanita. It's wonderful getting to talk about it with you and with everybody. I've loved seeing your comments and your questions. Thank you all.
Thank you, Vanita and Joyce. Really an amazing conversation. We're so lucky to have you both. And Joyce, that's the bedside table book that we will all have and we will all refer to. And we really needed it at this time. We've got some wind in our sails, so you're going to be part of that wind. And Vanita, I do hope you'll come back to BigTent. You were fabulous. It's been great to meet you. So everyone have a great night. Thanks for coming to BigTent. We're not done and we're going to keep on fighting. And Joyce, you're really helping us with that. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.